So I talked about AWS Backup a few videos ago. The main idea of the video was to introduce the concepts in AWS Backup and how to do backup operations both manually and using infrastructure as code with something like Terraform, and also how to establish a comprehensive backup strategy across AWS organization with minimal effort when it comes to different types of resources that you typically use in an AWS deployment. But as an architect, one of the most frequent patterns that I come across in the real world is a lot of organizations having a really good backup strategy when it comes to backing up data, but missing the entire half of the equation when it comes to restoring and doing restore testing. Too many times I've heard people talking enthusiastically about their backup strategy only to ask about their restore testing or how frequent they do restore testing, and it turns out they just do maybe a manual restore test when an IT audit is around, or they may not have heard about automated restore testing at all. So if you're new to this channel, welcome. I usually make videos on topics like cloud, DevOps and software engineering in general. If that is something that piques your interest, subscribe. I'll be making videos on a weekly basis most of the time. Now back to the video. So why backing up data is just half of the equation is if you don't have comprehensive playbooks when it comes to how to restore data from the backup sources that you have, and if you don't test your backups frequently, when the actual disaster happens, you're going to end up with engineers who have no idea about what to do to restore the data. You're going to end up with even worse situations if they don't know how to access the backups, and you're going to have a bad time sticking to those RTO numbers, especially if they are low, especially if your system has high demands when it comes to availability. So I thought of doing a video on how to restore backed up data and to implement a continuous restore testing strategy with using new features in AWS Backup. So for this video, I'm going to use the same setup as I had in the previous video. I'm going to have two accounts. One account I'm going to use as the account that hosts the resources that actually has data, or they're supposed to have data, and the other account is the one that I'm going to use as a cross-account backup vault. So I talked about backup vaults, cross-account strategies, backup vault policies in the previous videos. So if you don't know what those words mean, go back to those previous videos where I explain those concepts in depth. So for a start, I'm in the account that has the workloads or the resources that hosts the data. This account is the one we called workload A, and in this account I have two resources that are supposed to represent data that should be backed up. One resource is a DynamoDB table and another resource is an RDS instance. So when it comes to restoring data from backups that are done through AWS Backup, different resources will have different approaches, so make sure that you go to the documentation and understand what should be done for different types of resources. So for this part of the demo, I'm going to use two scenarios. One is a fairly simple use case, a fairly low stakes situation where you have to restore data from backups that are in the same account as the resources that are being backed up. And this could be a situation, for example, where you have bad data in the database and you want to restore from an earlier backup point. For example, you tried to do a release and then the release went wrong, so you want to go back to the point before the release started. So let's go to DynamoDB and see what we can do when it comes to restoring data. So I'm going to go into the table and I'm going to go into the backup tabs, and here I have all the snapshots that are being created by AWS Backup listed. So how I know those snapshots are being created by AWS Backup is by looking at the ARN of the snapshot. If the ARN starts with AWS Backup, that means AWS Backup is being used, obviously. But you could also have DynamoDB managed backups. In that case, the ARN would start with ARN AWS DynamoDB. So before I do anything, let me just go into Explore Table and see the only document I have in the table. So for example, this location value is set to AU, and if I go to backups, I can see several backups that have been created a few hours ago. So if I select this backup, for example, that is of a different size, I should be able to restore this and see what the different value is. So when it comes to restoring snapshots, one major point I should make is that restores happen into a different resource. You can't restore snapshots into the same resource. That would overwrite data, and frankly AWS doesn't allow that. AWS Backup doesn't allow that to happen. So I'm going to select this snapshot and click on restore, and we are going to create a new table from that snapshot. So I'll just call this tracking restored. Now I talked about encryption in backups in the previous video in depth. To recap briefly, resources like DynamoDB handle encryption of the backups in a different way, and resources like RDS handle backup encryption in another way. So when it comes to DynamoDB, when you're restoring a backup, you have the option to encrypt that restored table in different ways. So for this case, I'm going to use the same key that I used for the original table, but you could have AWS managed keys or AWS owned keys. Now AWS owned keys are keys that are not visible in the KMS console, but AWS managed keys are basically keys that are allocated to the account and they're visible in the KMS console. The only downside is you can't apply specific policies, key policies into that KMS key. And I'm going to use the default role that is provided by AWS Backup, which is more than enough to perform the actions that are needed by this restore operation. And I'm going to click on restore, which should create a restore job. So if we go into AWS Backup in this account, and if we go into jobs, there's a type called restore jobs, and if we go into this, we can see a new job has been created and it's in the pending state. So we have to wait until this goes into completed status, and after that we can see a new DynamoDB table being created. Now while that is happening, let me go into RDS and do the same thing but in a different way. So if I go into the backup vault in the same account and filter the recovery points that I have by the resource type, or I could go by resource name even, but in this case I just have one RDS database, and I could select the latest snapshot I have and then I could restore this into a new instance. So I'll just select this and restore, and like I said earlier, the snapshots are being restored into a new instance, and I'll use the same default networking configuration. And unlike DynamoDB, you don't have a lot of flexibility when it comes to the encryption of the restored resource. In RDS, you have to use the same key. If you want to change the encryption key, you have to go through a different route, which we can discuss in a different video. I'm just going to skip a lot of production worthy configuration just because I'm just going to test this restore job, and I'm going to create a restore job which will be reflected here. Alright, so the restore job for DynamoDB has been completed. Now if I go to DynamoDB, list the tables I have, I should see a new table called tracking restored. And if I go into explore table items, I can see the value I have for location for that item is different, which is from a previous version of this data. So the restore job for the RDS instance has also been completed. I could go into the database instances and I can see that there's a new database instance called MyDB restore test, which is the name that we used when we created the restore job, and it has been restored with the data that we specified in the snapshot. Right, so that was the first scenario, which was a pretty low stakes situation. But let's imagine another scenario where you don't have access to the in-account resources. Let's say, for example, your account has been compromised and someone with access to this account alone has deleted the resources and deleted all the backup snapshots available in AWS Backup too. And that's why you have cross-account backups that have separate access policies and are separated by an account boundary that can't be accessed by the same people that access these resources on a day-to-day basis. So in that case, to restore from a cross-account snapshot, you first have to copy the cross-account snapshot from that account into the target account or the member account. So in this case, I'm going to go into the cross-account vault and then start a copy job. So I'm in the central backup account, the account that I use as a cross-account backup destination. And if I go into AWS Backup and into the vault, I can select any number of these snapshots to be copied, but I'm just going to select one of the DynamoDB snapshots to copy across to the member account. So before I do this, I want to make sure that I am able to copy snapshots into the destination backup vault. Now that is handled by something called a vault policy. If you go through the previous video, I explained what a vault policy is. So if I go into the Terraform configuration, I could show that the vault policy that I used basically does this with this condition. Right, so the next step is to just select these snapshots and then copy it into the destination account. Now I could just select copy back into the source account, or I could use a different account if that is needed. But in this case, I'm going to just copy this back into the source account. I'm going to specify 30 days as retention, and I'm going to use the same IAM role that is provided by AWS Backup by default. and this will create what's called a copy job. It's accessible in the same place as other types of jobs in AWS Backup.
1 minute later.
Alright, so the copy job has been completed. Now I can go back to the destination account, or in this case the member account that actually has the resources, and I can see this snapshot in the backup vault in that account. So I'm in the backup vault of the member account, and if I go to the recovery points, there should be a new recovery point for DynamoDB, but the easiest way to get to this snapshot is to filter by the source account ID. And in this case, any snapshot that has a source account ID is a snapshot that has been copied from a different account. So for an example, this is the snapshot that we just copied from the central cross-account backup location. So if I compare this side by side with another snapshot that has been made locally or that has been made in the same account, we can see there's no section that has details about a copy job. In this snapshot that has been copied from a different account, you can see the copy summary, for example, that shows that this was copied from the central backup account. So the steps after this are the same. If I again filter by the source account, I just select the snapshot and then restore this into a new table. So it's important to understand that you can't directly restore snapshots from a different account. You have to first copy the snapshot into the account that you want it to be restored. Alright, so that was a short demo on how to restore backup snapshots into production instances. You could probably use this to write a couple of playbooks that addresses different types of resources and addresses how to restore those backup snapshots when the time comes. It's also important to practice those playbooks. It's not enough to just write them and put it in Confluence or whatever the document management system you have. You should periodically test those playbooks. You should periodically train your engineers to use those playbooks. Otherwise, that effort is also going to be lost into a page that has 0 views after you write it. So that addressed 2 scenarios that needed immediate attention. But also there's another use case that we can talk about when it comes to restore testing. Restore testing is making sure that the data that you back up are actually restorable and they can be included in those specific playbooks that I just mentioned. So maybe around last year, restore testing had to be done in somewhat of a manual way. You had to write your own Lambda function to be triggered whenever a backup snapshot would be created. But AWS has introduced a new feature called restore testing, which can be used for this specific use case. Now, the beauty of this feature is that you can create a restore testing plan just like you would create a backup plan, and also you could include the results of this restore testing into an audit report. So if you can remember from the earlier video, I mentioned about maintaining compliance of backup strategy for the entire organization. So with restore testing and validation of those restore tested instances, you could set up an entire compliance workflow for the backup strategy that you have. So when it comes to the time where you have to provide evidence for having an effective backup strategy, this could be your evidence that you provide to the auditor. So you don't have to go through different resources, you don't have to go through different screens that might confuse auditors that might not have enough knowledge on AWS itself. You could just provide an auditor-friendly compliance report. So for a short demo, I'll create a restore testing plan for the DynamoDB table snapshots that we create from the backup plan that we created in the earlier video. I'll just go into create restore testing plan and I'll just call this DDB tracking. And to keep this demo short, I'll just put the test frequency into an hourly frequency so that it starts within 1 hour. So AWS recommends that you do restore testing on a different account so that you wouldn't step on actual production workloads that are running in production and you wouldn't come across, for example, resource quota limits. But in this case, I'm just going to use this account because this is not a production account. This will not have any impact if I use the same account. And for a restore testing plan, I can specify specific vaults. And how it happens is if I specify the vault, it would pick either random or latest recovery points. And I'll just select the same vault that I copy the backup snapshots into. I'll just say all the recovery points from the last 7 days are eligible for this plan, and I can select either the latest recovery point or a random recovery point. So if you want to introduce some kind of random testing into your recovery testing plan, this would be the option. For this case, I don't use point in time recovery options. but that could be part of it too. So for resources like DynamoDB, you could have point-in-time recovery by having incremental backups. That's not part of this video, so I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to create a restore testing plan. And the next step of creating this is to assign resources to this testing plan. So if you can remember, this is similar to creating a backup plan. You would create a backup plan and then you would assign resources into that backup plan. So I'm going to assign the DynamoDB table I have. So the thing with restore testing is the resources that are created during a test, they would be immediately deleted. But if you want to keep them around for additional testing, additional manual testing, you could retain it for a specific number of hours. So for this case, I'll just specify 1 hour, but this could be any number of hours up to 168. And I'll just select the specific DynamoDB table I have. And for this testing, you could skip encryption, but that will depend on the type of resources that you're testing. Now the plan has been created. This will create restore testing jobs in a scheduled manner. So it will be every hour and it will probably start around the 30th minute of the hour.
One eternity later.
Alright, so it has been some time since I created that restore test plan, and it took some time for the restore job to be created, but now it's complete. One way to get to this restore testing job history is to go to the jobs view and filter by restore type. The value we are looking for is test. So any kind of restore job that is created by a restore test is tagged with the value test here. So if I go into this job, I can see that the status is completed, but the validation status is still ongoing. So it's doing a basic validation of the instance that was created as part of this restore testing job. But if I wanted something extra, like wanting to validate existence of certain data fields in the database, I could also do that by triggering jobs as the restore testing job completes. But for now, I'm just going to go with the standard validation step. And if I go into DynamoDB and look at the tables, I can see that there is a new table called AWS Restore Test Dash and some UUID. Now this is the table that was created as part of that restore testing job. So always it's going to be something like AWS Restore Test and a UUID. And since I specified that this should be retained for at least 1 hour, I have access to the table. So I could, for example, go and explore the table items and see what kind of data has been restored. So I hope that was useful in terms of having a complete approach to backup and restore. I'll just go through this one other feature that will be helpful when it comes to compliance tracking of your backup jobs. So there's a new feature called Backup Audit Manager, which allows you to specify audit frameworks that could be helpful in keeping track of the effectiveness of your backup strategy. So this works similar to the Audit Manager service that is available as an overall service. This also makes use of AWS config when it comes to keeping track of resources. But if you're not looking for something that comprehensive, if you just want direct reports, you can also have Audit Manager reports. For example, if you want a report plan that creates backup jobs reports or restore jobs reports, for example, you could have that automatically created and also delivered to an S3 bucket of your choice. So this is a really easy way to provide those evidence when it comes to IT audits or compliance of your systems. So I hope you'd be able to use these kind of features in your advanced AWS design. So I hope that was useful. I try to avoid too much detail in these kind of videos, because if you're watching this video, you're probably looking to gain an understanding and then go into details that are available through, for example, AWS documentation. But I hope you're able to get that idea. If it was useful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you haven't. I'll be doing more videos like this in the future. That interaction also helps the channel. It helps to get the channel in front of more users. So if you can, help me grow this channel more. That's me for now. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.